Hi everyone, welcome back to Earl Grey Books. I'm Ali. I'm here today to do my final ranking for my Eurovisionthon 2023 reads. So this year, all up, I managed to read 14 books during the readathon. This wasn't quite my original goal. I'll leave the links to the two vlogs that I did down below if you're interested in seeing what I thought I was gonna get. But I'm still happy with this. Last year I read 11. In 2021 I only read 4 books during the readathon, so I'm happy that every year I've been going up. Obviously between 2021 and 2022 that was a bigger jump, but I'm still happy that I went up a couple this year. I also managed to read a couple of different countries that I hadn't read from before, so I'm pretty happy with everything. Would I have liked to have read a few more? Yes, but I just ran out of time. So we're going to go through the 14 that I read. I'm going to give you my thoughts and we will organize them from worst to best. So let's jump in. So let's start with number 14. Which I feel like if you watch my vlogs is probably not a surprise, but The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. This was my book for the Netherlands. So I had started this one last year and then I just ran out of time to finish it, and I had been really enjoying it. So this year I found this copy for $1 secondhand. When it came to the readathon, I reread the first 250 pages that I'd read last year, and I still really enjoyed them. And then it just started to go downhill from there. As I said in my vlog, this needed to be like a 350, 400 page book, not a 650 page one. It is incredibly slow, not a lot happens, and there's a lot of stuff that is just feels very much like it's just drawing it out so that there's more words and more pages rather than actually adding anything to the story. There's also 3 layers to this story and they really don't add anything. It really could have just been the 1, maybe the 2. It really didn't need 3 different timelines going on. It just didn't pay attention to 2 of the timelines anyway. So I gave this 1 star. I did finish it, but it was not a fun time. It was not a fun time. Would not recommend. Absolutely not. Okay. That's really the only one that I feel like I actively disliked. So number 13 was That Hair by Djamila Pereira de Almeida. So this was my book for Portugal. This is a literary fiction, which is not a genre I tend to enjoy, but this wasn't terrible. This had an interesting premise. So the chapters would begin talking about the narrator's hair and an experience around that. She is a Angolan Portuguese woman living in Portugal for most of it. It's talking a lot about her family, her identity, and of course connecting to that idea of her hair. It could have been done so well, but it just wasn't. As I said, the chapter would start with that sort of memory and then it would go on a tangent about the family or some other part of her identity or some experience, and then would kind of return to the hair, but it wouldn't connect in any way. So it was just very muddled. I really think it could have been a really, really good book if there'd just been a little bit more of a connection between those 2 parts of the story. It just needed something to bring them together. There was some beautiful writing and everything, but it just was missing. It was just missing something for me. So I did give that one 2 stars, but I didn't dislike it. It was kind of boring very confusing, but could have been good. Next was my book for Estonia, which was The Savior of Lenasme by Marie Sart. I think this is literary fiction, maybe sort of like about a mother and her daughter, and they are quite poor and they are struggling with like medical bills. The mother loses her job, and it's about, well, actually, to be honest with you, I don't really know what it's about, because that was kind of very much how I felt about the book. Was I was following it at the start. It kind of lost its way, and I felt like the book didn't even know what the purposes of the book was, or what the story or the message or the characters even were. It was not painful to read, like it was kind of weirdly interesting, even though very confusing, and just a very sudden sort of ending of like, oh, that's it. And I read this one on Scribd, and I literally was like, it must be missing some pages, because that makes no sense. But it was all right. It was all right. Next, we're going with Sisters of the Winterwood by Raina Rosner, which was my book for Moldova. I had such a complex relationship with this book, because at the start, it was interesting, and then I really wasn't liking it, and then it kind of like went up, and I was like, wow, this is actually really good, and then it just plummeted again. It was a journey for sure. So this is the story of two sisters. It is separated into their two point of views. I did kind of like that, because one of them was just in normal prose and the other one was in verse, so it was easy to distinguish between the two voices, if nothing else. And I do like that, because I hate when you're reading a multi-POV book and you're like having to flick back to check which perspective you're in. So at least that did kind of break those up. And this has a sort of fairy tale, fantastical element to it. Again, this was one that had so much potential and yet fell flat. It tried to do way too much. There were about 3 or 4 different elements, and they were all really cool on their own, but it just needed to be cut down to maybe 2 of those things instead, because otherwise things just got lost, and things were sort of like one of the big plot elements, well, should have been one of the big plot elements, was only sort of thrown in here and there. It felt like it had no real bearing on the story at all, but it was supposed to be this really important part, and it was supposed to be really to do with the identity of the 2 sisters, and yet it was kind of just shuffled to the side for these other 2 things of like, one was interesting. The characters are Jewish, and that was done really well, but it should have gone with sort of that element and this major plot element that should have been there. And there was a whole thing in between that took up most of the story, which just wasn't that interesting. It's very hard to explain this without completely spoiling it, but I'm hoping that made some kind of sense. But let's move on to the next one, which is I don't even know what number we're up to anymore. This was Negative Space by, why didn't I write this author's name down? This was my book for Albania. I remember her first name. It's Lugeta something. I'm a really great booktuber. I totally know what I'm doing. Lugeta Loshanku. Did I say this was poetry? This was poetry. I used to love poetry. It used to be one of my most read, it's not really a genre, like form, I guess. I used to read a lot of poetry. Anyway, haven't done that in many years, just kind of fell off. And this was the only poetry collection I had on my TBR this year. It was fine. Part of the reason that I stopped reading poetry so much was because I just kind of lost that emotional connection I had. When I first started reading poetry, found that it was a really great way to not really express my emotions, I guess, but I just had a lot of emotional responses to the poetry I was reading, and I just stopped having that, and I did not really feel anything for this collection either. It was interesting. I liked some of the poems. My favorite, as I mentioned in the vlog, was actually a poem about Shackleton's right-hand man. And yes, like right-hand man from Hamilton has been playing in my head every time I have to say that sentence. But that was a really cool poem. But nothing else in here. I couldn't tell you what any of the others are about, and I read this about a week and a half ago. So just didn't really stick with me. Okay. I think we're up to number 9 now. For that, we're going with the first book that I read for the readathon, which was Armenian Myths and Legends. This is put together by the Charles Rivers editors, so there is no specific author. This is a very short, it's a very short book. I can't remember how many pages it is now, but it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a book about Armenian myths and legends. This was interesting in the way that I had never heard these stories before. I don't know anything about Armenian history, let alone Armenian myths or legends, and it was really interesting, and I liked that the book would often connect the mythological figures with figures from other mythology, and would be like, you know, this person is somewhat similar to Athena or to Loki, or, you know, different figures from different mythologies across the world, as a sort of, it was a nice kind of like jumping off point of like, okay, well, I know who some of those people are, so I can kind of understand the sort of ideas surrounding them. So that was really interesting. Because it is a super short book, there is no context given whatsoever. There's no introduction, it literally just throws you in straight away. And there was also no index or anything like that. So it was very much, it should have been a good book to start learning about Armenian myth and legend, but I feel like there is a expectation that you already understand a good amount of history from Armenia, but also the surrounding countries, and especially around sort of ancient history, and that's not something that I personally know. So for me, I needed a little bit of something there at the beginning or at the end, just to give it a little bit more context and all that sort of thing. But it was, for a book put together by, I don't know, a publishing company that I literally can't find anything about, it's not that bad. Number 8, we jump to Finland, which was The Woman Who Borrowed Memories by Tove Jansson, who is the creator of the Moomin series. This is a little short story collection. I think this was the 3rd or 4th book that I read. Again, short stories are not always my jam. There are a few collections that I really like and a few short stories that I love. But on the whole, I tend to struggle with collections. I found a lot of these quite boring. And it's insane that it is this high up on the list, because the writing, it's beautiful. So even though the stories did not captivate me apart from a couple. I can see that Jansen has obvious talent as a writer. So I don't really have too much else to say about that one, other than I've never read anything else from her before, and I find her fascinating. After reading this, I looked up some stuff about her, and she seems honestly like she was really cool. So I mentioned in the vlog as well, and in my review of this one, that I'm kind of hoping that next year I can find a book about her for Finland, because I think she'd be really interesting to learn more about. So there we go with that one. Okay, number 7 was my final book for the readathon, which was Baltic Facades. Now I don't remember which order the countries are listed in, but it is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I'm gonna go alphabetical and hope for the best. So Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania since 1945 by Aldous Pers. Yeah, that's a guess. So I use this as my book for Latvia. This was, a little non-fiction. This was literally only 206 pages long. This was really interesting. Again, I don't know a whole lot about those regions. I know a little bit about Lithuania, but more during the war sort of era. The one thing I will say about this is that it says that it is sort of the story since 1945, but there is a lot of like historical background and pre-war and during the war information that's given, which is good, but it was also, I would say, probably a good quarter of the book was that, and I felt like it kind of rushed through things after that. I mean, it's a very short book, so it was, I think, like 50 or 60 pages of historical context, and then it felt like some of the things were kind of missed out in the rest of the book because, you know, that room had been taken up, and then there was only this kind of short period, and of course that's counting the index and things like that as well. I will say my favorite chapter in this book was actually one about like art and music and writing and all that kind of stuff in the 3 countries, which was, I think, maybe like a 15-20 page chapter, but I really liked that, which makes sense because that is my area of interest already. But I honestly was really happy to see that one after like a 60-page chapter about economics. I was like, thank God we have some like cultural history to jump in here, because I don't really care about economics. That's not my area. So I was like, thank God that we just have some cultural history to jump into here. But as I said, this was an interesting read. Number 6 was Women and Change in Cyprus by Maria Hajpavlo. I still don't really know. So obviously this was my book for Cyprus. This is another non-fiction. This is about feminism. It was really interesting. I talked in a reasonable amount of detail about this one in my last vlog, in which I mentioned that the thing that I didn't like about this book that kind of bumped it down to number 6 is the statistics. Nothing wrong with the book, I'm just not a statistics person, so I felt often quite confused by a lot of that, and as I mentioned again in my vlog, some of the numbers didn't actually really seem to match up with what was being said. But on a whole, this was really interesting, and again, as I mentioned in the vlog, I think this was from 2010. I would still be really interested in looking up some more of this stuff. Haven't had the time yet, but one day I will just spend a couple of hours Googling women in Cyprus, I guess. Okay, next we go into our top 5. Ironically, I own all of these but one, which is kind of interesting, I think. So we're going first, obviously, with number 5. I decided to pick Broken Bonds by J. Bree, which was my book for Australia. I'm putting this one here because this was a reread for me. It was one that I felt a little bad about picking, because it's a fantasy book. It's not even set in Australia, but I like to try and read things that I hope will teach me something about the country. But being an Australian, having lived here for pretty much all of my life, I was like, you know what, I just want to read a fun reverse harem fantasy. So that's what I did. And as I said, it's a reread, so I enjoyed it, but I felt bad about putting it higher on the list. Also, this is not the best one in the series. I've only read the first 2.5 really at the moment. I'm working on book 3, but this isn't the best in the series so far. So that's that one. And then number 4 is the one that I don't own, which was In Which Margot Halifax Earns Her Shocking Reputation by Alexandra Vasti. This was my book for the UK. This is a little historical romance novella. Again, I could read millions of books about the UK. My family is all from there, so I felt like I didn't really need to pick something that would specifically teach me about the UK. So I just went with something fun. This was great. It was adorable. It was delightfully smutty. Fantastic time reading this, and so it's at number 4. Number 3. I decided to go with Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys, which is my book for Lithuania. This was also a reread. This is the 3rd time I've read this book, and it's one of my all-time favorites. But again, because it is a reread, I didn't want to put it as number 1 because, one, I don't think it quite deserved that this year. But also, I just felt like number 3 was a good spot for it. So this is the reason that I know a little bit about Lithuanian history. So it's not actually set there, but it does follow a young teenage girl and her mother and brother, and as well as a whole other bunch of people from Lithuania as they are exiled to Siberia by the Soviets to work in like a work camp in, I don't remember what year. I don't think there's a specific year, but it's sometime during the war. As I've said, this is one of my favorite books. It's a beautiful book. It really is. I think I didn't enjoy it as much this time. This is going to be part of another vlog in a couple of months' time, so I don't want to talk about it too much here either, because that will kind of spoil that vlog. But yeah, I don't think I enjoyed it quite as much this time, and I will talk about that in that vlog. Okay, top 2. So number 2 is The Story That Cannot Be Told by J. Casper Kramer. This is I guess it's a middle grade. I would say it's a middle grade. I was gonna say even like young YA, but it's not quite. This was my book for Romania. It is set in 1980s Romania, in Soviet times, and this was really interesting. I started reading this one last year as well, and I just ran out of time. I'm so glad that I read this year, because I definitely I needed this I needed something good. This was perfect. I had a really fun time reading it. It's a story about a young girl going to live with her grandparents in this Romanian village, having left her parents behind in the city. And she's a storyteller, so there's this kind of folk tale aspect to it as well, and it's really interesting. It's also just a really beautiful and emotional book. I didn't mention this in my vlog, I just forgot, but the character's best friend, she has like a number of medical things, and one of them is actually, from what I could tell, very similar to something that I had probably around the same age as this character is, and to do with my leg. And it's hard to explain because there's so many different, it's not really a disability or something, it's a specific type of, this is so hard to explain. It's a metal frame on her leg that's like attached to her leg by pins and things. And there's a number of reasons that this contraption, because that's kind of what it looks like, is used. So I believe it was quite different to the reason that I had it, but I had this thing twice as a child. And as a kid, I never saw this. I never saw it in books or films. I didn't even really see it in real life. I didn't know anyone else who had ever had these. And recently I've been seeing it more and more in books, and also just people walking around with them. And I have to admit that when it came up in this book, I did actually tear up quite a bit, because it was just done in a really nice way, and it was never a big thing. It just is just sort of a thing that she has, and that made me quite emotional. But it was just a wonderful story all around. Which means number one was The Bone Woman by Clea Koff, which was the second book that I read. And okay, so I put this in number one because it didn't feel right putting it anywhere else, but I wouldn't say it's the best written book of everything that I read. Does that make sense? Like, it's not badly written, but the reason it was number one for me was that I felt like it had a real impact on me, and I learnt a lot from it, and it was really fascinating, and I wasn't expecting that. I was so blown away by this. I just felt like this book really, I don't want to say changed my life, but really gave me a different perspective, and it was so interesting, and so putting it anywhere else on the list just didn't feel right to me. And I didn't even say this was my book for Croatia, and absolutely, I don't know what else to say about it. I just really, really, really enjoyed it. But that is it. That is everything that I read and my thoughts on them. I don't have anything else to add, so I'm just gonna say, and thank you again to Helen for hosting. As I say literally every time I talk about this readathon, it is my favorite, my absolute favorite, and I am so glad that Helen has continued to host it. She puts so much work into this, and as I've said every single time I mention Helen, she is one of the loveliest people I've ever met in my entire life, and I just have so much fun doing this readathon, and she's such a sweet person, and it's so nice to see people joining in and having fun as well. So if you participated, I hope you enjoyed yourself, and again, thank you, Helen. You are an incredible person. I love this readathon so much. But that's it. I will see you all in a couple of days. I hope you're all doing super well. I'll see you next time. Bye.